The final body system that we're going to be talking about here in our homeostasis unit is immunity. It's about how our immune system works to defend us from pathogens and disease. So, to begin, humans have several adaptations to prevent pathogens. When we say pathogens, what we're really talking about are viruses, bacteria, other microorganisms which can cause disease. And we have built in several adaptations that prevent us from being attacked by pathogens. So, for example, our skin provides a barrier through which many pathogens cannot pass. Mucus in our nasal cavity helps to trap pathogens before they can penetrate into our body. Cilia in the trachea, acid in the stomach. These are adaptations that can kill pathogens before they're able to infiltrate our cells and cause damage. And they allow for us to take care of these pathogens before our immune system is necessary to keep these pathogens out. If pathogens are able to penetrate through those barriers, then once those pathogens come into our cells and tissues, that's when our immune system takes over. And there's two sort of categories of immunity. There's innate immunity, which is sort of a general immune system response to a pathogen. It's one that we're born with, and it's non-specific. It just generally will attack cells that it doesn't recognize as self. Okay, so it's an immune response that is general and will attack any foreign cell. There's another type of immunity called adaptive immunity, and adaptive immunity is a type of immune response that develops once we are exposed to a pathogen. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We might be exposed to a pathogen through a vaccine, or we might be exposed to a pathogen through actually getting a disease. Having a pathogen inside of us, we can then develop adaptive immunity to that. So when we talk about immunity, what we're talking about is part of our immune system is also part of our circulatory system. So main cells that are responsible for our immune response are white blood cells, called leukocytes is the general term for them. They're part of our immune system. They have a nucleus, so they're a little bit different from red blood cells, which don't have a nucleus once they mature. They have one or even more nuclei sometimes. They're typically less abundant than red blood cells, and they're larger than red blood cells. And there's a variety of types of white blood cells. When you start looking into immune response, it gets very complex. There are many different types of cells which have different functions, and certain immune cells trigger other immune cells to act, and we're not going to get into all of those details, but you should know that it is a very complex system. One type of immune cell are called the phagocytes. These are the types of cells that can find a pathogen, engulf, and destroy it at the site of infection. Okay. They can leave our blood cells and go into other tissue of the body to fight those pathogens. And when we have an active infection by a pathogen, the number of these phagocytes will increase drastically. It can go from 20,000 in a drop of blood to 1,000,000, preparing to fight off this pathogen. Another type of immune cell are called lymphocytes, and there's several different types of lymphocytes. There's B cells and T cells, natural killer cells, and they have a variety of functions, but what you should know is that they work together to provide us with immunity to a pathogen. Okay. The lymphocytes are the cells that produce antibodies. Okay. So let's define some terms here. Antigen. So antigens are proteins that are on the surface of cells that sort of identify the cell. And so our immune system knows which antigens our own body cells have. And so if our immune system senses antigens that are not part of our own bodies, say an antigen that's on a bacteria, then it will start the immune response. So the antigens are the proteins that are on pathogens that trigger an immune response. And so these lymphocytes, they are the cells that produce antibodies. Antibodies act against these antigens. Okay? And this is what can produce long-term immunity for us, this adaptive immunity to a disease. Okay? When these lymphocytes produce antibodies, these antibodies are small molecules, they're proteins, and they have a shape that matches up with the shape of the antigen that they're going to counteract. So they're specific. So an antigen to the influenza virus is specific to that strain of influenza. Those antibodies will help identify and attack that influenza virus, but they will not offer protection against some other pathogen. Okay. So if we look at some models here that kind of show what this might look like. Here we have antigens, just sort of a model that shows, they won't actually look like this, but you can help understand, is that this pathogen, say it's a type of bacteria, has a specific proteins, these shapes that are on the outside of the cell, and antibodies have a matching shape. Antibodies are these Y-shaped proteins, and they have binding sites that match up with these antigens. And so this antibody that you see on the right has a different set of binding sites than this antibody, and that's because they're specific to certain pathogens. And so these antibodies can help to defend against disease in several ways. One way is they can help to clump up. Here you see these pathogens are these green circular shapes, and you can see the antigens are these yellow semicircles. What you see are these antibodies have, at the binding site, have attached to these pathogens and have sort of clumped them together. That's called agglutination. So when antibodies bind to the antigens, okay, they do several things. They can help neutralize them by preventing these pathogens from attaching to cells and entering cells. They clump those pathogens together. Okay. They can also then sort of mark these pathogens to start attracting other types of cells to come and destroy them. So once these antibodies attach to this bacterium, that is a signal for these phagocytes to come in and engulf and destroy them. So you can think about immunity as either active or passive immunity. Active immunity is, when the body itself produces its own antibodies. Okay, so this could be natural active immunity where you guys don't know this because you were immunized against chickenpox, but when I was a kid, there was no chickenpox vaccine, so when I was younger in elementary school, I got chickenpox from somebody at school. And so I got sick with the disease, I had bumps and rash and so forth, but my immune system fought off the chickenpox virus, but it also created long-lasting antibodies in cells that are circulating around my blood today properly. And if I were to be exposed to the chickenpox virus today, my immune system would kick in very quickly. Those antibodies would attach and mark that chickenpox virus, and my immune system would probably fight it off quickly and I would never get sick with it again. Okay? So that's active natural immunity. I developed that immunity because I was exposed to the chickenpox virus. Now sometimes this might be temporary, sometimes it might last for an entire lifetime. Another means of acquiring that immunity, however, is what's called acquired active immunity. This is when we develop immunity due to a vaccination. So vaccinations, you were all vaccinated against the chickenpox. And so vaccinations work by the doctor injecting into our bodies either a piece of a pathogen, just a protein, just an antigen, or a dead pathogen, a weakened pathogen into our bodies. And what happens is because it's just a part of the virus or the bacteria, or it's been weakened so much, our immune system immediately attacks that pathogen. But not only does it attack it and destroy it, and we don't actually get sick, but it then allows our immune system to create antibodies which will protect us in the future. And so a vaccination works by sort of priming our immune system, causing it to create antibodies against that pathogen that will stay in our body for a long period of time. Sometimes you might need a booster vaccination. You may have heard of that, which means it's an additional vaccine that you get after several years to sort of ensure you still have immunity to that pathogen. And so the process of developing these vaccines takes a long time. It takes at least a year to 18 months. So you know that recently there's been talk about a vaccine for the novel coronavirus, for the COVID-19 disease. It takes 12 months to 18 months at a very minimum. That's a very quick development of a vaccine. So it's not something that could happen very quickly. And with the coronavirus, it's only been in our population, spreading through our population for matters of months. So it's a brand new disease. Humans have no immunity to it because it's just made the jump from animals to humans. And therefore scientists are now working on developing an effective vaccine, but again, it's not going to be something that is developed in a matter of weeks or even months. There's also a concept of passive immunity. And this is also something you've probably heard talked about in terms of COVID-19, in that let's say a person is infected by the novel coronavirus, develops COVID-19, their immune system fights it off and they recover from it. Well, then what we would expect is in their blood, in their bodies, there are antibodies that would protect them from a future COVID-19 infection. And so right now what scientists are doing is encouraging people that have gotten COVID-19 and recovered to donate blood, because you can then extract some of those antibodies from that person's blood and give them to another person. Okay? And that can provide them with what's called passive immunity. They weren't actually exposed to the disease, but they were given those antibodies in an injection. Also, something I've heard in the news just in the past day or so is there's testing that can be done now in which you can take a blood sample and you can tell if somebody has been exposed to COVID-19 by looking at the antibodies they have. So even though, let's say, I've never gotten sick, there is a possibility I was infected with COVID-19. I didn't actually get the symptoms, but if you tested my blood, maybe I would have antibodies against it. And so this is one way that people are looking at when can people return back to work after being infected. And one way they might decide that is by doing this test to see if the person has developed immunity to COVID-19. So this diagram just sort of shows overall a very simplified version of how vaccines work. Okay, works with our own body's natural defense system by injecting into us a weakened or a killed form of a disease. Our body learns how to fight it off, creates antibodies which stick with us for years, protecting us in the future. Vaccines have only been around for about 70 years or so. One of the probably the first effective mass vaccination program that happened was with polio. Okay, this was in the 1950s, and so polio is a communicable disease that affected hundreds of thousands of people around the world each year. And it's a disease which can lead to muscle wasting and disfiguration, especially of the legs and lower limbs. It's a very difficult disease. And so when Jonas Salk developed a polio vaccine in the 1950s, look at this graph. This shows the number of polio cases in the United States over that time period. Once the vaccine was introduced and it was distributed widely and children were vaccinated, look what happened to the number of cases of polio in the United States. It just dropped drastically, okay, eventually dropping to basically zero. Today in modern society in the United States, everyone is vaccinated against polio in their early years, and basically nobody gets polio anymore. So we basically have almost eradicated this disease thanks to vaccinations. Just another topic to think about is, so vaccinations are required for students to attend school typically in kindergarten, and there's a whole list of vaccinations that are required for students entering kindergarten, and those vaccinations have basically prevented these very dangerous diseases from spreading through the population. And if you have a significant proportion of people immunized against a certain disease, then you can protect an entire population. It's a concept called herd immunity. Once enough people are immune to the disease, it's very unlikely to spread throughout that population. And so there are times when vaccines don't actually work. So, for example, measles is a disease that we're vaccinated against in the MMR vaccine. And when a person gets the vaccine for the measles, typically it works, but sometimes it might not work. So there might be people, for example, in our school, that even though they're vaccinated, may not have developed that immunity for measles. But because the rest of the people that are around them are vaccinated, it's not very likely that they would ever be exposed to the actual pathogen because everyone else has been immunized. The problem is that when you have significant numbers of people that are not immunized, then that herd immunity is lost, and that puts people at risk. Even people that have been immunized are put at risk when you have a significant part of the population that is not immunized. And the final topic we'll talk about is allergies. So allergies are actually an immune response. Allergies are when our bodies develop an immune response to an antigen that's actually not harmful. For example, peanuts. Okay. So a person with a peanut allergy gets a sort of exaggerated immune response when they are exposed to peanuts. Even though peanuts are not a pathogen, they're not harmful, some people just develop these allergies to specific substances. And people can have allergies to all sorts of things. Medications, environmental pollutants, pollen, dust, bees, peanuts, other types of nuts, animal hair, etc. And so for some reason, people that have allergies, they start an immune response when they're exposed to those allergens. The cells of the immune system release chemicals called histamines and other agents that cause inflammation. Okay? And so the things we think of as sort of allergy symptoms are caused by basically these inflammatory agents that are released. Sneezing, runny nose, tearing eyes, swelling of the throat. Those things are immune responses. And if they are severe and left untreated, they can lead to what's called anaphylactic shock, where a person's body shuts down. They stop being able to breathe because of this response. People with severe allergies, they might carry with them an EpiPen. So the medications we use to treat allergies are called antihistamines, things like Zyrtec or Benadryl that you may have heard of. These are medications which act to counteract these histamine molecules. Epinephrine is what's in an EpiPen, which counteracts those allergic responses. So again, here you just see a model of this where you have a person exposed to an allergen, B cells from the immune system, okay, recognize that, and then for some reason react, and they develop these mast cells, which when they are exposed to that antigen in the future, release the products of the immune response, such as histamines, which leads to those symptoms. All right, so that's the rest of our notes. That's the end of our notes on homeostasis. So I hope you guys have a great day. Okay, we'll talk to you later. Miss you all.